Hello and welcome everyone. Today in this lecture we are going to discuss Rabindranath Tagore and critique of his ideas on nationalism and also his views on cosmopolitanism. In previous lecture we have discussed Rabindranath Tagore as a thinker, as a poet, as a political philosopher, and we situated him in the larger context of Indian intellectual tradition, as well as his response not just to the Indian condition and Indian challenges, but also the global challenges, and we tried to understand his thought and his ideas in the Indian as well as in the global context. And we have discussed his views on nationalism, where he was not just critical of Indian nationalism or any other form of nationalism, but he developed a critique of the very idea of nationalism, and that is something very interesting in his thought process. So he himself was deeply engaged in the social and political issues of India and continued to engage intellectually with some of the burning debates and discussion around social and political philosophy, challenges of India as well as the world. But he gradually rescue himself from the active participation in the politics, whether it is the anti-colonial struggle in India or in any kind of political agitation. So he started in the beginning as a very active participant in the social political movement. So in Swadeshi movement, in some of the Congress session in Bengal, he actively participated. But from the Swadeshi days itself, on various issues, he gradually developed an intellectual difference from the tactics or the strategies followed by many contemporary political leaders, including the Congress and its various leaders. So we have discussed these things in the previous lecture. Basically, we have focused on his critique of nationalism as an idea and why it is obstructive and lead to moral, ethical corruption in individual, in the society, and we need to transcend, or we do not need to actually follow that path of nationalism. One of the interesting point in Rabindranath thought is, and that we have to understand, that his intellectual understanding is very straightforward and very simple in a sense. It lacks any theoretical pretensions, and that allowed him to think or see things as they are, and accordingly he responded to the situation, and therefore he considered nation and nationalism as it emerged in the West, and he thought that the nationalism that emerged in the West was product of the historical condition and circumstances of the West, which is absent in India. And if we blindly imitate and follow such idea and apply it in the Indian context, the outcome will be very destructive. And therefore, he believed that it is a passing phase of history and not necessarily the inevitable one. So his faith was in the larger march of humanity and human civilization, rather than any particularities of nation or nationalism or any other ethnic particularities and specificities. So he realized the larger overall march of humanity towards universal humanity, global solidarity, rather than based on any narrow conception of nation or nationalism. So he wanted Indians not to follow that path, which in his opinion lead to lot of destruction, bloodshed and violence in western countries, which influence the whole world. And therefore he thought that India can better develop its character, its own identity, even without following the path of nationalism. And that is something very interesting, and why Rabindranath Tagore becomes such a fascinating intellectual. We will discuss when we will discuss his views on cosmopolitanism, where contrary to many other scholars, in his opinion, cosmopolitanism is something which is not absence of any particularities or one's own tradition or inheritance, but his views on cosmopolitanism is actually flourishes or emerge out of one's deep engagement in his or her particular culture or tradition. So that is very fascinating in Tagore. So therefore, even on developing India and its Indian character, he believed that one can develop it in a better way, taking into account the cultural sensibility of India rather than blindly imitating an idea which emerged in the modern West, and which is very problematic and contrary to the human cooperation and solidarity. So that we have discussed. Today we are going to discuss critique of Tagore's views on nationalism and his views on cosmopolitanism. In the next lecture we are going to discuss his views on idea of man and also the debate between Gandhi and Tagore. So if you look at the critique of Rabindranath Tagore views on nationalism, we find he invited a lot of criticism, not among his own fellow countrymen including Gandhi and many other leaders in India, C.R. Das, but also a lot of foreign scholars strongly criticize Tagore for his views on nationalism. First, we find that his strong opposition to nationalism from several Western intellectuals, notably like George Lucas and D.H. Lawrence and many others, believed his views on nationalism is too poetic, too simple to understand the nuances, to understand the historicity of this idea or the historical relevance of this idea. So in Lucas' criticism, what he writes about Tagore is that he was a wholly insignificant figure who survives by sticking scraps of the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita into his works amid the sluggish flow of his tediousness. So basically this criticism against Tagore's views on nationalism is a kind of nostalgic or deeper association or affiliation with India's Upanishadic or Bhagavad Gita and other text which Rabindranath Tagore followed, and in Lucas' opinion, which is like Tagore, because of his association with this Upanishadic ideals and Bhagavad Gita and its ideals, he really failed to understand the contemporary or his own historical time and the necessity of ideas, the problems or the challenges that society in his time is facing, and then using an idea which is there in the ancient time or in ancient India and seeking to revive it or reapply it in solving the contemporary problems. Lucas and many others find such ideas very problematic, and they also believe that therefore Tagore do not have as much influence as perhaps say Gandhi and many other pragmatic thinkers have. There may be a variance in the proportion of criticism against Tagore, but many other scholars also argued that Tagore somewhat remain in his poetic intellectual realm aloof or somewhat indifferent to the political happenings. That is perhaps true to some extent, and he did not really actively participate like say Gandhi, Nehru and many other thinkers did, but his experimentation in Shantiniketan and his intellectual engagement with these debates are something which remains fascinating and shape the consciousness of modern Indian self or that's why he remains one of the prominent modern Indian thinker. And through Tagore, Gandhi, we can better understand the debates that was going on during the anti-colonial struggles in India. Like Partha Chatterjee and many others have argued about this unpragmatic or idealistic approach in Tagore when it comes to solving many social and political challenges, and that makes him aloof. And Rabindranath Tagore was himself aware of such unique or aloofness in his political position or intellectual position on some of these debates, and we have discussed it in our previous lecture. So for Lucas, because of this sticking or associating with the Upanishadic and other ideals and trying to revive such ideals and trying to use such ideals to solve contemporary problems was a bit problematic for Lucas. Similarly, Lawrence, the other scholar, criticized Tagore for creating the binary of East and West. So we understand that the world of early 19th or 20th century, there is a kind of binary between East and the West, Orient and the Occident, and that kind of binary produce a kind of polar opposite civilization, and then we try to compare between East and West, try to ensure the dialogue between East and West. So Rudyard Kipling, his famous views that East is East and West is West, and never those shall meet. So with that kind of understanding, which Tagore criticized, and certainly after Edward Said work on Orientalism, we understand the political part of this kind of knowledge production and creation of binary between two kind of hegemonic block, East and West, which is very plural, which is layered, which is very very different, heterogeneous, and then you in the heuristic principle in terms of knowledge production, you create two blocks and then try to compare between the two, which help in sustaining the colonial rule or imperialism. So what we find in Tagore was a kind of critique of such kind of aloofness, such kind of differentiation between East and West. But according to Lawrence, he himself get entrapped in this binary of East and West and trying to ensure some kind of dialogue between the two, which is very problematic in the words of Lawrence. So we also find is that Tagore's views on nationalism was criticized by many of his Indian colleagues and contemporaries as well, and their critique is like Tagore completely miss this liberating potential of nationalism, and therefore they argued that Tagore's views on nationalism is hopelessly romantic and even illogical. Now this is a very interesting point to think about, where, as I have said in my previous lecture, there have been different waves of nationalism. So when Tagore, Gandhi and many other Indian leaders were engaged in anti-colonial struggle, that was the third wave of nationalism, and nationalism has many aspects to it. Tagore's understanding was a kind of intellectual engagement with this idea of nationalism, devoid of the practical or the immediate historical circumstances of his time, necessity of his time, and therefore these thinkers believe that it is the luxury for a thinker like Tagore to detach himself from the contemporary requirement or necessity of his countrymen and think about or imagine a world which will be free from all kind of nationalistic, particularistic thinking. But for many leaders and thinkers who were involved in day-to-day politics, they thought there are necessary or there are liberating potential in the nationalism which one cannot ignore, and therefore in their opinion Tagore's views on nationalism remains very romantic and even illogical. So, despite of so many evils which we have discussed through Tagore in the idea of nationalism, nationalism also develops some solidarity. It has certain cultural roots where people are willing to die for their country. So, that strength comes not just by some kind of mechanical construct of an idea. Unless these ideas have some cultural, psychological roots, and that makes the idea of nationalism relevant even for our contemporary times. And in many countries, we see the priority of our nation, priority of nation over the other nations. So, America first, India first, and such ideas are reflection of such such understanding of nation and nationalism, which continues to resonate in our contemporary times. So, when we were fighting the British, many Indian thinkers believed that the nationalism and India can contribute in the global community only when it achieves political freedom or assert its national identity independent from any foreign rule. And therefore, in their opinion, that idea of nationalism has enormous liberating potentials, which Tagore seems to completely miss. So, like C.R. Das points out the contradiction in poets' thinking. He pointed out that true assimilation of people's culture could not occur without achieving national independence, as suggested by Tagore. So, Tagore wanted to develop a solidarity which is not fragmented in the narrow domestic walls of nation, nationalism, or any other kind of particularities. So, he was talking about universal humanity, the solidarity, the new man, new moral modern man. We will discuss about his views on idea of man. That man is not guided or restricted by his or her narrow nationalistic obligation or morality or ethics. That man consider himself or herself as a part of larger global universal self, and therefore he believed that nationalism is a kind of obstruction in such ideas. But contrary to such view, C.R. Das, Chittaranjan Das argues that there is the contradiction in poets' thinking, where you cannot have assimilation of people's culture without having the national independence, without achieving the national independence. So, true dialogue will happen only when when a nation has independence, political independence. Without political independence, to think of true dialogue, true assimilation is a illogical or a kind of wishful thinking for many other thinkers, and they find it very contradiction, including Gandhi. We will discuss in the next lecture. Now, they further argue that a nation might find its proper place in the family of nations only when it achieved an identity. And what would be that identity? That is something we need to seriously think about, and through that understand or analyze Tagore's views on nationalism. So, therefore, it is irrational to think of gaining international unity without attaining national identity. When a group of nations or different cultures tries to develop universal harmony, universal cooperation, that harmony and cooperation or assimilation of differences will not be possible unless one attain or achieve an identity, and that identity at a collective level cannot be caste, cannot be religion, cannot be ethnicity. It has to be a nation or national identity. So, many of these leaders believe that to attain international unity, international cooperation, or universal solidarity, there is a necessary or necessity to achieve national identity in the first place. So, what we find is in his approach or views on nationalism, Tagore was too poetic in his analysis on nationalism, and he did not take into account the various historical forces, especially new forms of nationalist imaginaries like newspapers, novels, textbooks in the age of print capitalism. So perhaps there is some limitation in terms of assessing the historical forces which enables such kind of imaginaries to be constructed in the first place. So in Tagore and his engagement with these ideals of nationalism, and as we have discussed in previous lecture, that Tagore was a unique political thinker. His social and political thought is very different from many other Indian political thinkers, precisely because of his poetic or idealistic approach to politics and society, which makes him similar to many thinkers, certainly like Aurobindo Ghosh, Mahatma Gandhi, and many other modern Indian thinkers. But in terms of influence, in terms of actually shaping the pragmatic politics, Rabindranath Tagore remains somewhat aloof, somewhat uniquely positioned in terms of the larger historical developments that were taking place in India and in the world. So one of the criticism that is labeled against Tagore is that because of his poetic approach, he fails to understand the historical forces, and these historical forces certainly I have taken from Benedict Anderson, who considers or who defines nationalism as an imagined political communities, and these imagined political communities become possible because there are new developments, especially through print capitalism, which leads to a standardization of language, and the language enables and cut across this time and space, develop a horizontal solidarity, because millions of people not meeting each other in their physical life can imagine themselves in their psychological world, in their mind space, with millions of other whom they will never interact, but they can develop a solidarity and emotional bonding with them, and that is enabled through the print capitalism. So Rabindranath Tagore, and in his assessment on nationalism, we see that he really do not engage with the historical forces or the historical circumstances which enables and which necessitates this kind of imaginaries to become possible. Now the other criticism that can be labeled against Tagore's views on nationalism is his overemphasis, in fact obsession, with this engagement with East and West, and the best example of such engagement and dialogue is his educational experiment in Shantiniketan. So his obsession with this East-West encounter and collective progress of mankind seriously take the issue of, he was too engaged with this encounter with East and West and progress of one common humanity to seriously take the issue of nationalism. And this dialogue or encounter with East and West remains his ideal, and therefore he thought of nationalism a kind of obstruction, a kind of restriction to this global universal cooperation to flourish, to emerge, and that is why perhaps he somewhat underestimated the liberating potential of nationalism or necessity of nationalism for a country fighting imperial rule. And the other point is his alternative programs to nationalism, like cooperatives, which he initiated in many parts of rural Bengal, and Swadeshi Samaj, failed to energize the masses, and its success were also very limited. So that's the other criticism of Tagore. So in place of nationalism or nationalistic kind of ideology, he favored cooperation among the people for their economic betterment, economic improvement, or Swadeshi Samaj to replace the hierarchy of caste and creed among the people, and to develop some kind of solidarity, do not really energize the people enough, and they were deeply influenced and shaped by the new fervor of nation and nationalism in India. So that's the some of the criticism on Tagore's views on nationalism, but as we are aware that nationalism necessarily lead to conflict, violence, and we have seen time and again the war, conflict and the violence perpetuated in the name of national superiority, and some examples were too brutal to even explain, such like Nazi German or fascism, which take the nationalism to a very different level of all encompassing control or regimentation of thought and individual lives. So nationalism has a dark side of it, and Tagore was well ahead of his time to understand or to express his reservation or his criticism of nationalism, even when nationalism has some kind of universal acceptance, not just in the anti-colonial countries fighting the imperial West, but also in the West itself. So Tagore remains in his intellectual engagement with nationalism much ahead of his time, but in the historical circumstances which shaped the politics of his own country, say India, his influence was somewhat lesser than, say, the influence of leaders like Gandhi, Nehru and many others. Now we move to his views on cosmopolitanism, and that is something which is the cherished ideals of Rabindranath Tagore, and contemporary times also the challenges that we are facing, say whether it is global warming or threat of nuclear warfare or global terrorism or hunger or starvation or death from something which is curable diseases. So the issue of sustainable development, that requires global cooperation, global ethics, and these challenges cannot be tackled by any country or a group of country, even if it is very powerful economically and militarily. It requires global cooperation, global association among the nation. So cosmopolitan ideals are very relevant in contemporary times, but these ideals are not new. So in the Greek time or in the Roman time, and also in ancient Indian ideals of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, these ideals of world as a one family, or this contemporary phase of globalization certainly makes this ideal more profound, more relevant than it was in any previous phase of human history, because of the challenges that our contemporary global world is facing, which necessitates global cooperation and different countries coming together. So Tagore was more for such global cooperation, global ethics, and developing a kind of ethics or morality which will transcend the particularities of nation and nationalism. So I'll begin his views on cosmopolitanism with this phrase or quotation from Tagore, where he says that he who sees all beings in his self and his self in all the beings does not hate anyone and knows the truth. So that's the basis of his philosophy of self, his views on self, which he explained as a being which transcend his own particularities, his own local circumstances, local cultural or traditional setup, and include all the beings in his self and his self in the all beings. So that complete immersion of self in the other or in the other human being allow that individual not to hate the other, but to develop a kind of mutual trust, dialogue and love. That is the basis for human cooperation, human solidarity that Tagore believes, and nationalism or any other kind of particularities obstruct such mutual cooperation, dialogue or trust to emerge. So he believes that the one who sees all beings in his self and his self in the all beings does not hate anyone and knows the truth, and that's the fundamental truth. So Tagore, despite of so many wars, conflicts, world wars, violence and all kind of mechanical repetition of everyday life, remain hopeful, and that hope was in universal cooperation, in universal solidarity, universal manhood or universal humanity, and that was for him the truth of human existence, not the war, not the conflict, not the hate with others, which is somewhat fanned by this nationalist fervor, and he wanted this kind of man to emerge. So Rabindranath Tagore offers a new cosmopolitan. Many scholars like Martha Nussbaum argues that social and political thought in Tagore enables us to criticize patriotism and in place of that develop a cosmopolitan imaginary, and we will discuss more on that. So what we find in Tagore's views on cosmopolitanism is the possibility or enabling of developing these cosmopolitan imaginaries for our 21st century world, and he was articulating it in the very beginning or the first 2-3 decades of 20th century. So this cosmopolitan modernity which is there in Tagore is radical departure from many of his contemporaries, which were deeply engaged with the national question or the question of nationality. So he was a departure for such kind of thinking. He advocated a form of cosmopolitanism, which is the idea that all human being is a world citizen and owe primary allegiance to the world community. So the moral obligation of human being is not to his or her own community or nation, but to a global community, which is the humanity at large. And Tagore wanted to develop that kind of solidarity, that kind of universal humanity, and therefore many scholars like Martha Nussbaum, as I have said, believe that the social and political thought of Tagore can be a very solid basis to develop cosmopolitan imaginaries in the 21st century. Now he wanted to go beyond the nationalism to a global cosmopolitanism, and transcending the cultural boundaries is required to develop this universal human. So that transcending the limitation of particularities or nation is required to develop this global cosmopolitan universal humanity. So again, to quote from Tagore, he writes, "Neither the colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism nor the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship is the goal of human history, and India has been trying to accomplish her task through social regulation of differences on the one hand and the spiritual recognition of unity on the other." Now that encapsulates his thought on cosmopolitanism, where he believes that the colorless vagueness. So to explain you this idea on cosmopolitanism, many people argue that cosmopolitanism can be defined as a imaginary which not just transcend the local or the national, but also emerge in absence of such local or national. So the other way to put it is a kind of detachment, a kind of moral, emotional, psychological detachment from one's roots. So for many liberal scholars like Kantian abstraction or Stoics philosophers, cosmopolitanism or cosmopolitan person is someone who do not belong or remain attached to a particular national, local, cultural community setup, and imagine himself, develop the emotional or psychological outlook to consider himself as a global citizen, completely detached from any kind of particularities. Tagore is cautioning against such kind of colorless vagueness of cosmopolitanism on the one hand, and the fierce self-idolatry of nation worship on the other. So the other side of this kind of imagination is the fierce worshipping of national identity, and he believed that both of these extreme opposites is actually contrary to the global goal of human history, and he believed that this global cosmopolitan attitude and imaginary is possible when one is willing to live with the difference, adjust with the difference, and develop a common unity. So he thought, or he believed that India can play a significant role in regulating its own differences and also understanding the spiritual unity or recognition of this spiritual unity as its necessary or inevitable goal. And that kind of approach towards India's position in a international setup or in a global community of nation, you will find in many other thinkers as well, be it Nehru, Gandhi, Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and many Aurobindo Ghosh. Many others believed in this unity of mankind, a spiritual unity. So the country remains different, they represent their own self, their own identity, but they have to ultimately recognize the necessity of global cooperation to tackle many of the global challenges. So Tagore believes that India can and should manage these social differences as well as understand this spiritual unity. And he further writes in developing this unity in his work, The Way to Unity, that I have come to feel that mind which has been matured in the atmosphere of profound knowledge of its own country and of the perfect thoughts that have been produced in that land is ready to accept and assimilate the cultures that come from other countries. Now here he is making a departure from many other cosmopolitan imagination or thinking, whereas for him the role or significance of one's own tradition, one's own inheritance are equally important for developing the cosmopolitan imagination or developing universal solidarity, and to understand the other culture and assimilate the other culture, accommodate the other culture. So for him the knowledge of one's own country. So for Tagore, cosmopolitanism is not negation of one's own culture, one's own tradition, but to develop a sensibility which is immersed in one's own culture and tradition and yet open or flexible to accommodate and accept from the other culture and other tradition, and that way one can think of developing the global cooperation and universal solidarity. He spoke of the intellectual union of East and the West, and he wanted that the best of each culture should compensate inadequacy in the other culture. So in Tagore it is not the absence of one's own tradition, one's own culture, but one's identity is shaped by this thing, their own culture, their own tradition, and yet they are willing to accommodate and learn from other culture. And this mutual trust and encounter, in Tagore's opinion, will help in solving the inadequacy in any other particular culture or individual culture. So that way the different cultures or adjustment with different cultures will lead to mutual give and take, mutual dialogue, and it will enrich or strengthen the global solidarity or global attitude and sensibilities, which cannot be developed on this mechanical statist approach to global world or global cosmopolitan world. So Tagore was someone who also emphasized the contribution of non-Western culture, which is denied by many Western thinkers, and their Europeanization of world. So the West is not a kind of geographical expression, but it is there in the intellectual, psychological world of non-Western countries and societies. Tagore believed in this contribution of non-Western cultures in developing such global cosmopolitan thinking and tradition. So it continues from what we are just discussing, that the knowledge of particular cultural tradition is the basis for understanding others, and it can help in relating others morally. So one's own culture, the particular culture, Tagore is not negating or undermining, but he considered it as a building block, as a basis to understand other morally or interact with others in a more accommodative way, which help in removing the suspicion and mistrust and one-way dialogue and discussion. So for Tagore, cosmopolitanism does not derive its justification through the theoretical contemplation of abstractions. So as I was saying, many thinkers like Kant, Kingdom of Ends, and many others theorized what, or Rousseau theorized about this cosmopolitan attitude and sensibilities by abstracting the concepts, the question of cosmopolitan sensibilities. But for Tagore, it's a kind of practical way of achieving that that solidarity, and I think in Tagore one can find the resources for developing such practical sensibilities or approach to develop cosmopolitan imaginary. So it's not the abstraction, but a kind of achievable in the real practical world by understanding one's particular culture, but willing to understand the others, and also then giving and taking in the mutual trust and cooperation. So for Tagore, the motivation to be a cosmopolitan is ultimately grounded in the existential orientation, a way of being in the world, and that way of being in the world is also to be rooted in one's own culture, and that's why his views on cosmopolitanism is also considered as a rooted cosmopolitanism. So he traveled the world, he understand and develop a dialogue or friendship with other culture, other continents, other individuals, but remain deeply and emotionally connected with his own native land, Bengal or India. So that he does not see as a obstruction or as a problem. So loving one culture, immersing oneself with one's culture, understanding its thought, developing one's sensibility from their own culture is in no way an obstruction to develop a global cosmopolitan approach and outlook. That is something very unique in the Tagore's views on cosmopolitanism. And his faith in the essential unity of mankind influenced his vision about the historic battle of the nationalism of the East against the imperialism of the West, and that is perhaps his obsession and belief, and he was so convinced about this human unity or unity of the humankind that he somewhat undermined the historical role of nationalism in the East to fight the imperialism of the West that was going on in many Asian and African countries. Now, Tagore's cosmopolitanism is also in part a consequence of his philosophical and historiographical conviction that social life cannot be reductively captured by the statist conception of history. So, he believed, as we have discussed in previous lecture, the problem of India is not political, but a social problem, and that social problem cannot be tackled by the state and its intervention or mechanical approach, but by developing the solidarity based on the cultural sensibility of the people, and the idea of Swadeshi Samaj and other things is reflection of such approach. So what we find is Tagore's peerless thinking on the philosophical underpinnings of cosmopolitanism at the level of pratyahik, that means everydayness, resonates with great force in a world that is simultaneously wrapped by the contrary attitudes of globalization and various form of particularism. So in the contemporary times we find this kind of tussle, this kind of opposition or contradiction between the global forces of capital, goods, sensibilities, movement, social movement on the one hand, and assertion of particularities on the other. and that makes Tagore's views on cosmopolitanism even more relevant today than it was when he was writing and articulating his thought. So indeed, the future of the planet rests upon how well we can mediate between these two opposite polarities that is there in the world. So some scholars call Tagore as rooted or realistic cosmopolitanism rather than someone merely contemplating or abstracting his thought on cosmopolitanism, which means that those who respect the variety of tradition and nationalities but also believe in the universal values that all people in all countries should accept, and that is the way to understand Tagore's cosmopolitan universality. So his cosmopolitan universality is not to reject the particular culture or particular nationalities, but to understand that particular sensibilities and develop to and not to ignore, underestimate the universal value of the solidarity or the unity of human civilization. And that is the way for developing cosmopolitan universality and makes him more applicable and relevant than those who are merely contemplating about cosmopolitan thought and imagination. So finally, for Tagore, underpinning the cosmopolitan sensibility rests a poetics of humility, flagging the limits of the human when faced with the world's seemingly limitless diversity. The recognition of limits caused the cosmopolitan desire to emerge. So that's, he believes, something which is natural flow of human imagination, human solidarity, which may begin with their own particular cultural national outlook, but it will ultimately emerge in a global cosmopolitan universal outlook as well. So that is our views on Tagore's understanding of cosmopolitanism and why he remains a very significant thinker, not just for his views on criticism or views on nationalism, but also due to his acute or correct understanding of cosmopolitanism as a way forward for the world, and understanding the unity of humankind as the basis or the real truth, and that should develop on trust, love, or mutual cooperation. And he considered nationalism or obsession with the nationalism as an obstruction to such kind of cooperation to emerge. And on this point, it is interesting to note that he predicted in 1920s or 30s this possible cooperation between the fighting nation of Europe. So when one of his friends asked him about how he can remain so peaceful in the circumstances when the world is fighting or engaged in so much of conflicts and violence, Tagore was deeply influenced by that question, and then he responded that this is merely a kind of passing phase of human history, and ultimately the nation of the world will realize the necessity of cooperation to tackle their individual and the collective problem. So on these views on cosmopolitanism, you can look at some of these works like Ramchandra Guha and Pantham. We have been following it in many of the lecture. For these views on cosmopolitanism, you can particularly look at Rustam Bharucha, Another Asia, Rabindranath Tagore, and Okakura Tenzin, and also this very interesting work by Sachidanand Mohanty and his chapter on the world in a nest, the cosmopolitanism of Rabindranath Tagore. This chapter is from his book on cosmopolitan modernity in early 20th century India. And also Ashish Nandi, The Illegitimacy of Nationalism, Rabindranath Tagore and His Politics of Self, you can look at, and also a very interesting article on Tagore's conception of cosmopolitanism by Saranendranath Tagore. So these are some of the readings on Tagore's views on cosmopolitanism, and if you have any question, comments, please feel free to write. Thank you.